In 1974, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia that would quietly shape the entire global economic order for the next 50 years. The terms were straightforward. The United States would guarantee Saudi Arabia's security, military protection, weapons, political support. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would do two things. It would price its oil exclusively in US dollars, and it would invest its surplus oil revenues in US Treasury bonds. Within 2 years, every major OPEC nation had signed a similar agreement. The petrodollar system was born, and with it, the architecture of American global dominance that most people alive today have never known a world without. That architecture is now cracking. I'm Richard Hale, and in this video, I am going to show you exactly how the dollar became the world's reserve currency, why that status is now being challenged in ways that have no historical precedent in the post-war era, what the countries driving that challenge actually want, and what the realistic timeline and consequences of a shifting dollar order look like for the United States, and for every person watching this video. This is not a prediction of imminent dollar collapse. Anyone telling you the dollar is about to disappear is either uninformed or selling something. But it is an analysis of a structural shift that is already underway, one that most Americans are not being told about clearly, and one that will define the geopolitical and economic landscape of the next 30 years. If you are new to this channel, subscribe and turn on notifications now. This is exactly the kind of analysis you will find here. To understand where the dollar is going, you need to understand how it got here. Because the story of dollar dominance is not simply a story of American economic strength. It is a story of a very specific set of historical circumstances. Circumstances that are now, for the first time since 1944, beginning to change. The year that matters is 1944. The Second World War is not yet over, but its outcome is no longer in serious doubt. Representatives of 44 allied nations gather at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war international economic order. The United States holds approximately 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves. Its industrial base is intact, the only major industrial economy that has not been bombed into rubble. Its military is the most powerful in human history. It is, without serious contest, the dominant power on Earth. The agreement reached at Bretton Woods reflects this reality with mathematical precision. Every participating currency will be pegged to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The US dollar will be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. The dollar becomes, in effect, the world's currency. Every international transaction, every trade settlement, every central bank reserve, denominated in dollars, backed by American gold, guaranteed by American power. For the next quarter century, this system works. American industrial and economic dominance is genuine and overwhelming. The dollar's credibility is not questioned because there is no credible alternative. But by the late 1960s, the system is under strain. The Vietnam War is enormously expensive. President Johnson's Great Society domestic programs are enormously, usually expensive. The United States is spending far more than it is producing and financing the difference by printing dollars that are, in theory, backed by gold it does not actually have in sufficient quantity. Foreign governments begin to notice the discrepancy. France, under Charles de Gaulle, begins exchanging its dollar reserves for physical gold, openly challenging the fiction that the dollar's gold backing is real. Other nations follow. In August 1971, President Nixon ends it. The United States unilaterally suspends the convertibility of dollars to gold. The Bretton Woods system collapses overnight. The dollar is no longer backed by anything except the full faith and credit of the United States government and the habits and dependencies of a global economy that has been built around it for 27 years. This is the moment that most people think should have ended dollar dominance. It did not. And the reason it did not is the petrodollar deal I described at the opening of this video. By linking the dollar to oil, the single commodity that every industrial economy in the world requires, the Nixon administration engineered a replacement for the gold backing that Bretton Woods had provided. You did not need gold to give the dollar R value. You needed oil. And if every barrel of oil sold on the international market had to be purchased in dollars, then every nation in the world needed to hold dollar reserves simply to keep their economies running. The genius of the petrodollar system, and it was genuine strategic genius, was that it created a self-reinforcing cycle of dollar demand that required no gold, no fixed exchange rate, and no formal international agreement to sustain. Countries needed oil. Oil required dollars. Dollars required holding U.S. Treasury bonds to store them productively. Holding U.S. Treasury bonds funded American government spending. American government spending maintained American military power. American military power guaranteed Saudi security. Saudi security produced more oil. More oil required more dollars. For 50 years, this cycle ran, and it produced consequences that shaped every aspect of the global economy. The United States gained what the French economist Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called an exorbitant privilege. Because global dollar demand was structural and constant, the United States could run persistent trade deficits, importing more than it exported, without facing the currency devaluation that would punish any other nation doing the same. It could borrow at lower interest rates than any other country on Earth because global demand for U.S. Treasury bonds was essentially guaranteed. It could fund its military, its government, its consumption at a cost that no other nation could replicate. And it could use the dollar as a weapon. This is the dimension of dollar dominance that is most directly relevant to what is happening right now. Because the dollar's status as the reserve currency gave the United States a tool of economic coercion that had no precedent in the history of international relations. Control the currency that the world needs to function, and you control access to the global financial system itself. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is the messaging network that processes the vast majority of international financial transactions. It is, in practical terms, the plumbing of the global dollar system. And the United States, through its dominance of that system, can cut any nation off from it, effectively removing them from the global economy without firing a single shot. This weapon has been used selectively for decades. Iran, North Korea, Cuba, targeted sanctions, asset freezes, secondary sanctions that threaten any third-party institution that does business with designated entities. For most of its history, the threat of dollar exclusion was sufficient to enforce American foreign policy preferences across a wide range of nations. Then came February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine and the United States and its allies responded by freezing approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions and removing Russia from SWIFT, the largest deployment of dollar weaponization in history, something changed in the calculations of governments around the world. Not just governments that consider themselves adversaries of the United States, governments that consider themselves neutral. Governments in the global south that had watched American sanctions policy for decades and had privately concluded that their own reserves, held in dollars in Western institutions, might one day be subject to the same treatment. If you are sitting in Beijing, in Riyadh, in New Delhi, in Brasilia, in Pretoria, in the weeks after the Russian reserve freeze, the question you are asking is not whether you agree with American foreign GN policy toward Russia. The question you are asking is, what is to stop the same thing from happening to us? That question is the true origin of the de-dollarization movement that has accelerated dramatically since 2022. And it is essential to understand it correctly, because most Western commentary gets it wrong. De-dollarization is not primarily an ideological project. It is not primarily driven by anti-American sentiment, though that exists. It is not primarily a BRICS political initiative, though BRICS has become its institutional vehicle. It is primarily a risk management response by sovereign states to the demonstrated willingness of the United States to weaponize the financial system. Nations that hold large dollar reserves, and every major economy in the world holds large dollar reserves, now understand that those reserves can be frozen. That is not a theoretical risk. It happened to the world's 11th largest economy holding the reserves of a nuclear power. The precedent has been set. Now let me show you what the response to that precedent looks like in concrete, in measurable terms. Saudi Arabia, the original architect of the petrodollar system and the United States' most critical energy partner in the Middle East, announced in 2023 that it is open to settling oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. The Chinese yuan, the euro, and potentially a new BRICS currency settlement mechanism are all under active discussion. This is not a completed transaction, but the fact that the conversation is happening at all, publicly, from Riyadh, would have been considered geopolitically unthinkable as recently as 2020. China has been the most systematic and most strategically patient actor in the de-dollarization process. Over the past decade, Beijing has built an alternative financial infrastructure with a clarity of strategic purpose that Washington has largely failed to take seriously until very recently. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, is China's alternative to SWIFT for yuan-denominated transactions. It processes a fraction of SWIFT's volume today, but its existence means that a parallel settlement infrastructure exists and is being expanded. China has signed bilateral currency swap agreements with over 40 countries, allowing trade to be settled directly in yuan and the counterpart currency without dollar intermediation. The volume of trade settled in yuan has grown from essentially zero in 2010 to approximately 3% of global trade today. That number sounds small, but the trajectory and the deliberateness of its construction are what matter. China has also been the world's largest buyer of physical gold for the past several years, a fact that is almost entirely absent from Western financial media. The People's Bank of China has been accumulating gold reserves at a pace that suggests a long-term strategic intent to provide an alternative anchor for a potential future currency settlement system. You do not buy gold at this scale and pace for portfolio diversification. You buy it to prepare for a world where gold matters again. Russia, following its exclusion from SWIFT, has been forced to accelerate what was previously a gradual de-dollarization process. Today, approximately 80% of Russian trade with China is settled in yuan and rubles, up from essentially zero before 2022. Russia has become involuntarily but comprehensively a test case for whether large economies can function outside the dollar system. The answer so far is imperfectly but survivably. India, the world's most populous nation and one of the fastest-growing major economies, has been conducting a quiet but determined effort to expand rupee settlement for its international trade, particularly for its energy imports from Russia. India's position is characteristic of the broader global South dynamic, not anti-American, not ideologically committed to de-dollarization, but practically motivated to reduce exposure to a financial system that it now understands can be weaponized against it. BRICS, the grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which expanded in 2024 to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, now represents approximately 35% of global GDP and over 40% of the world's population. At its 2023 summit in Johannesburg, the creation of a BRICS common currency for trade settlement was placed formally on the agenda. The details remain unresolved, and the technical and political obstacles are formidable, but the political will to pursue it, expressed by nations representing the majority of the world's population, is a geopolitical development of the first order. Now, I want to give you the most important analytical distinction in this entire video, because here is where most commentary, both the dollar collapse alarmists and the dollar dominance defenders, gets it wrong. The dollar is not going to be replaced, not in the next decade, almost certainly not in the next 2 decades. The structural advantages of dollar dominance, the depth and liquidity of U.S. Treasury markets, the institutional infrastructure built around the dollar over 80 years, the absence of a credible single alternative are real and significant. No other currency comes close to meeting the technical requirements of a global reserve currency today. What is happening is something more subtle and in some ways more consequential than replacement. What is happening is fragmentation. The global monetary system is moving, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, from a unipolar, dollar-dominated order toward a multipolar system of competing currency blocks. A dollar bloc centered on the United States and its close allies. A yuan bloc centered on China and its economic partners. A collection of bilateral and regional settlement arrangements that bypass the dollar for specific trade flows without replacing it globally. This fragmentation does not end the dollar, but it erodes the exorbitant privilege. It reduces the structural demand for dollar reserves. It reduces the captive market for U.S. Treasury bonds. It reduces, gradually but measurably, the United States' ability to fund its deficits at artificially low cost. It reduces the reach and effectiveness of dollar-based sanctions. And it reduces the unique geopolitical leverage that dollar dominance has provided for 80 years. The timeline for this process is not months or even a few years. It is decades. But the direction is now clear in a way that it was not before 2022, and the pace has accelerated significantly since the Russian reserve freeze demonstrated to every government in the world what dollar dependence actually means in a conflict with Washington. Let me close with the question that matters most to the people watching this video. What does this mean for you? In the short term, the next 5 years, the practical impact on ordinary Americans is limited. The dollar remains dominant. U.S. Treasury markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world. The Fed's ability to manage the dollar and American monetary policy is not meaningfully constrained by what BRICS is discussing in Johannesburg. But in the medium term, the next 10 to 30 years, the erosion of dollar privilege has specific, concrete consequences that will be felt by every American. The cost of U.S. government borrowing will rise as the captive global demand for Treasury bonds declines. That means higher interest rates, higher debt service costs, and ultimately more constrained U.S. government spending on defense, on social programs, on everything. The United States has been able to run the world's largest national debt at manageable cost precisely because global dollar demand subsidized its borrowing. As that subsidy erodes, the fiscal mathematics change. The dollar's purchasing power in international markets will face more pressure than it has in the post-war era. Americans have enjoyed structurally cheap imports, from oil to consumer goods to manufacturing, partly because the dollar's reserve status inflated its international purchasing power. A dollar that is less universally demanded is a dollar with less international purchasing power. And the United States' ability to use economic sanctions as a primary foreign policy tool will diminish as more trade flows through alternative settlement systems that it does not control. The weapon that replaced military force in much of American foreign policy will become less reliable. The strategic implications of that shift are profound and largely unprepared for in Washington. The dollar is not dying, but the world it was built for, the world of 1944, when America held 70% of the world's gold and was the only industrial economy left standing, that world is finally, irreversibly receding. Understanding that transition clearly, without panic, without denial, with the analytical rigor it deserves, is the difference between being shaped by history and understanding it. That is what this channel is here to do. If this analysis changed the way you see the dollar story, share it with someone who is still adding the headlines. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next piece of this picture. And tell me in the comments, what aspect of de-dollarization concerns you most, and what do you think Washington should be doing about it that it currently is not? I'm Richard Hale, and I will see you in the next analysis.